His own mother named him Pain the moment he was born. Years later, he prayed one sentence, and it's the only prayer in this entire book that God is recorded answering. His name was Jabez, and to understand why that single sentence matters so much, you need to see where it's actually sitting. Open to 1 Chronicles. And before you get anywhere near a story, you hit 9 straight chapters of names. Father of son of, father of son of. Generation after generation, tribe after tribe, list after list, with barely a sentence of narrative in between. It is, by design, one of the driest stretches of reading in the entire Bible. Ancient readers valued these lists. For a real reason, they proved lineage, land rights, and identity. But as a reading experience, it is a wall of names with no faces behind them. And then, in the middle of chapter 4, buried inside a list about the tribe of Judah, the wall breaks. For 2 verses, the genealogy stops being a list and becomes a story. A man is introduced. We're told something about his character, we hear him speak, and we hear how God responds. Then, immediately, the list resumes as if nothing happened. That man is Jabez. And here's what makes it strange before we even get to what he says. His own mother named him for the worst day of her life. Not for a hope she had for him, not for a blessing she wanted to speak over him, but for her own pain in bringing him into the world. In the culture of the ancient Near East, a name wasn't just a label. It was closer to a destiny statement. Parents believed they were speaking something over their children by what they called them, by what they called them. So imagine growing up your entire life, hearing your own name spoken by everyone around you, and knowing that it means, quite literally, pain. This is not a story about a battle. This is not a story about a kingdom. This is not a story about a miracle. This is a story about one sentence, said once, by a man whose own name was working against him from the day he was born. And somehow, out of 9 chapters where almost no one gets more than a name and a father, this is the man Scripture stops to tell us prayed and stops to tell us God answered. Let's slow down on what a genealogy list like this actually was to the people reading it, because it changes how strange this interruption really is. These lists in 1 Chronicles weren't filler. For a nation that had just returned from exile in Babylon, being able to trace your family line back through the tribes of Israel was how you proved you belonged. It determined which land your family could claim, which priestly or Levitical duties you could perform, and whether you had any legal standing at all in the restored community. So when the chronicler sat down to write this book, list after list of names wasn't laziness. It was documentation, sacred paperwork in a sense, and paperwork nobody expected to be interesting, which is exactly why what happens with Jabez stands out so sharply. In verse 9, right in the middle of Judah's family tree, the chronicler suddenly slows down and tells us something personal. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, not more successful, not wealthier, more honorable, a description of character, dropped into a document built almost entirely out of names with no character description attached to any of them. Then we get the reason for his name. His mother called him Jabez, and the text tells us plainly why. Because she bore him in pain. In Hebrew, the name Jabez is built from a root connected to grief and vexation, so the wordplay is direct. She wasn't naming him after an ancestor or a hope for his future. She was naming him after her own suffering during his birth. Here's what most people miss. This wasn't a on-time insult that Jabez could simply shrug off as he grew older. In this culture, your name followed you into every room you ever walked into for the rest of your life. Every time someone called out to him, every time he introduced himself, every time his name was recorded anywhere, he was being reminded and reminding everyone around him that his existence was tied to someone else's pain. Scholars who study this passage point out that the connection between the Hebrew word for his name and the Hebrew word for pain isn't a perfect match letter for letter. It's closer to a reversal, almost like an echo. But that reversal is worth noticing for a different reason. It hints right there in the structure of the word itself that something about his story was going to end up turned around from where it started. So picture him growing up, brothers around him with ordinary names, tied to family or hope or heritage, and Jabez carrying a name that publicly announced his mother's worst day every single time anyone spoke to him. So here's where this gets interesting. Because a man carrying a name like that had two paths available to him. He could let it define him, quietly living down to what everyone assumed about him, or he could do something about it. Before we get to which path Jabez actually took and the exact words he used to take it, if you're enjoying this kind of close reading of the passages most people skip over entirely, this channel does subscribing before we continue. So consider subscribing before we continue. Because what Jabez says next, word for word, is more specific and more deliberate than almost any prayer recorded in the Old Testament. Remember, before Jabez ever says a word, the text has already told us he was more honorable than his brothers. That's important, because it means whatever he prays next isn't a desperate man grasping for a way out. It's a man of proven character choosing to name out loud exactly what he wants from God, instead of quietly accepting what his own name predicted for him. Here's the prayer in full. He calls on the God of Israel and asks for 4 specific things. Oh, that you would bless me indeed, that you would enlarge my territory, that your hand would be with me, and that you would keep me from harm so that I would be free from pain. Look at how deliberately built this is. The first request is broad, bless me. But in the Hebrew, that word isn't said once, it's doubled, an infinitive paired with the verb itself, a construction used elsewhere in Scripture specifically for emphasis. It isn't a polite, generic ask. It reads closer to, bless me, truly bless me, I mean it. The second request asks for enlarged territory. In the world of ancient Israel, this wasn't a metaphor for personal ambition the way it's often read today. Land was inheritance. Land was security for your family for generations. Land was tied directly to God's covenant promises to Israel. Jabez isn't asking to become famous. He's asking for the kind of stability and legacy his culture measured in acres passed down to your children. Third, that God's hand would be with him. Not just a blessing handed over and then left alone to manage it, but an ongoing presence. Someone with him in the difficulty still to come. And then the fourth request, the one that closes the loop on everything we already know about him. Keep me from harm so that I would be free from pain. Listen to what he's actually doing there. He is using the language of his own name and asking God to reverse it. His mother named him for pain. Now, as an adult, he is the one speaking over his own life, and what he speaks is the opposite of what she spoke. But it gets stranger. The very next sentence in the text, the very next thing the chronicler writes after recording this prayer, is 5 words. And God granted his request. Stop and actually sit with those 5 words, because in the context of this book, they are almost unheard of. And God granted his request. Not "and Jabez prospered," not "and Jabez became wealthy," but a direct statement that the specific thing he asked for, God gave him. In 9 chapters that are otherwise wall-to-wall names with no plot, this is one of the only moments where the text tells us explicitly that a prayer was spoken and a prayer was answered. Think about why the chronicler would break pattern for this. A genealogy list can tell you who someone's father was. It can tell you which tribe they belonged to, which land they were entitled to, which family line they carried forward. What it cannot do is tell you that someone spoke to God and God spoke back. That's not the kind of information a family record keeps. And that's exactly the one thing Jabez's 4 verses record that nothing else in these 9 chapters does. This is where the story closes the loop we opened at the very beginning. His mother marked him for pain before he could do anything about it. But this man, described as more honorable than his own brothers, refused to let someone else's naming be the final word on his life. He took the exact language used against him and turned it into the exact language of his own prayer, and the text tells us, without hesitation, that it worked. Now, here's where this gets complicated in a way worth knowing. About 25 years ago, this obscure 4-verse passage became the subject of a best-selling book that pray these words and expect expanded blessing, wealth, and success. Expanded blessing, wealth, and success. It sold millions of copies and generated everything from study guides to jewelry. But look again at what Jabez was actually asking for. Not personal fame. Not unlimited wealth, land, presence, protection, and freedom from the specific pain his own name had assigned him. It's a prayer about identity and inheritance, not a spiritual vending machine. The popular version of this story sells a formula. The actual 4 verses tell you something quieter and, honestly, more useful. That the words spoken over you at birth don't have to be the last words spoken about your life. So what do we actually walk away with from Jabez? First, a genealogy list can record your name, your father, your tribe, and your land. It cannot record a conversation with God. Out of 9 chapters of names, that's the one thing that made Jabez's 4 verses worth stopping for. Second, the name spoken over you at birth, whether by a parent, a circumstance, or your own history, doesn't have to be the name you carry for the rest of your life. Jabez took the exact word used to define his pain and used it to ask God for the opposite. Third, the text doesn't reward Jabez for a formula. It rewards him for 4 specific, honest requests, spoken directly to God, instead of quietly accepting what everyone assumed about him. So, here's the question I'll leave you with. If your name, or your reputation, or your story had been chosen based on the hardest day of someone else's life, what would you pray to become instead? If this kind of close reading of the passages most people scroll past is something you want more of, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Because in the end, his mother named him for her pain, but the God he prayed to answered him with something else entirely, and the only word Scripture uses to describe Jabez before he even opens his mouth is honorable.